thank Alessandro again. Okay, and we'll finish off with the panel, who will be led by Ethan Zuckerman from just around the corner. I leave it to Ethan to introduce the panelists, and I will try to leave it to him to manage the time, even though I may be sitting in the background and watching.
I'm Ethan Zuckerman with the Center for Civic Media just down the road at MIT. I'm lucky on the intro side of this in that I don't have to introduce two of my panelists because they've just introduced themselves and their work rather brilliantly. But I'll introduce Chris Conley immediately to my right, who is a fellow at the Northern California ACLU, where he's focused on a wide range of issues that include privacy and surveillance. And we've worked together previously at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society on many of these issues. I'm very grateful for the chance to sort of bring these three folks together to talk about privacy, because we're at a very interesting moment in time. As we've just been talking about, in a world of big data, whether we're enthusiastic about it or skeptical about it, in a world of social media, there's an enormous number of issues that come to the fore around privacy. And if you sit down and ask people their preferences on privacy, you'll often get a very different answer than what comes out in their behavior. Because if you look at people's behavior, people seem incredibly willing to put data out there, not just for friends, but also for advertisers, for marketers, and as was just pointed out, for researchers. The flip side to this, of course, is that when you explain to people where that data is going, what the implications are, people will sometimes get very scared. My work in this space tends to center around the world of participatory media, and particularly issues of freedom of speech and human rights. And the story that pretty much has my community in crisis the last couple of weeks is an utterly harrowing story from Nuevo Laredo, where people have been using participatory media to sort of document the movements of drug cartels. And drug cartels have recently decided to announce that they are well aware that people may be anonymous, they think, but are using social media to document cartel movements. And they announced this by hanging the bodies of 3 social media users from a prominent bridge in the center of town. So these issues are not purely theoretical. For some people in the world, they are quite literally life or death. But we have 3 people here who've done incredibly deep and thoughtful work on privacy, and because we have a very limited amount of time, first, I'm going to shut up and let them talk instead. And second, I'm going to ask if everyone would sort of respond to the question of, with all that we've thought about, with all that we know about privacy, what's the really big thing that we generally fail to talk about or fail to address when we think about this subject? I'm going to start with you, Chris.
Sure. So there are just,
Introduce yourself.
So, yes, my name is Chris Conley again. I'm a fellow with the ACLU of Northern California. I'm an attorney. I'm also a technologist. I've been on both sides of Mass Ave, so glad to be back here for a while. The hardest question with privacy is not so much what is it. We could talk about that for hours on end, but the question is, what do we do about it? We have all of these forces in society that are really pushing against personal privacy, from the market forces for monetizing data, to the real challenges, as pointed out earlier, about how do we handle informing people about these distant, indirect effects of information that are very hard to realize. My favorite story from a couple weeks ago, which is a little more pleasant than Ethan's, was people have learned that you can determine people's television habits through smart meters. Smart meters are sensitive enough to black pixels on a screen that if you aggregate the information, you can get a fingerprint of a show, and you can tell what they're watching. This kind of information is something that a typical consumer wouldn't even occur to them. And there's so many pressures that make it challenging. So my job and my challenge is, how do we actually enact change so that we can improve privacy, give people greater control with the technology that we're seeing emerge? The way I like to frame it is, taken from Lord Lessig, there are 4 different ways that you can impact social change. One is law. You can think about how do you regulate this? How do you put legal protections, put legal mandates, have liability that can pressure actors into changing? There are some challenges with that, and I'll get to those at the end of this, but that's certainly one out there. Maybe a less obvious one is technology. Technology directly impacts this kind of thing. We had an example from an earlier talk that you can imagine technology being used to tag content with metadata, to retain a record of where this content came from, and to go back and check for permissions, check for access controls around this content. And if it's been revoked, if someone has said, hey, I don't like that picture from when I was 18 and kind of a little bit foolish, can you please take that down, respect that? Technology can be built to do that. Of course, technology can also be built around, to make privacy more difficult. When you have smart meters that collect information that is much more sensitive than is apparent, technology can really erode privacy. You have market forces, and again, market forces can play both ways. You have the forces to monetize information, but you also have companies that react to pressure on privacy. You have Google Plus come out, and Facebook coincidentally come out about a month later with a bunch of privacy changes that strangely resemble what Google had done a month earlier. Some of that probably was coincidence. They don't change quite on a dime, but there's no doubt that companies react to perceptions of privacy. And then the fourth one, and kind of the fundamental for us, is norms. You have social movements, user understandings about privacy, expectations. And these are not orthogonal. These are not independent things. The key for us is how do you interact with these? How do you cause them to pressure each other to comprehensively create change? Norms, for example, are strongly determined by technology, by defaults. If you have a service like Twitter, where everything is public by default and people know that going in, there's an expectation of publicity. If you have a service like Facebook originally, where things were very closely confined, and then is shifted into a more public mode, there's a strong outcry because people have adapted the norm of this technology works this way, and I understand it, or I think I understand it, and therefore I'm going to react to that. And technology also affects norms by actually making people understand what happens. Can you build tools that show people how their data is being collected? Can you build analysis and research that shows people what can be inferred from data so that they have a better idea of what the constraints are? And there are many, many other things. Markets drive norms. Norms drive markets. If consumers want something and one company isn't giving to them, the competitor will. So the goal for me really is to find ways that we can use a multidisciplinary approach to address privacy problems and concerns that we have. And obviously from the ACLU, we have specific concerns. But there are many different factors here that have to come into play, and they have to be thought about together. It's not enough to focus on the law. It's not enough to focus on technology. You have to think, how do companies impact all of these different sectors? And so a lot of my work is actually, oddly for an ACLU attorney, I spend a lot of time working with companies. I'm based in Northern California, so Microsoft isn't right in my backyard, but lots of others are. And talking to them about, what are your defaults? Are you designing to give people more transparency and more control so they have more ownership and ability to regulate their own information? And you work with them on legal issues because, of course, having companies and nonprofit agencies and consumers who all are informed and active on an issue creates legal change. So I want to end by saying there are two birthdays that I'm thinking about right now that kind of relate to this. The first one is Microsoft Research, of course. 20 years of very multidisciplinary approaches to addressing problems. And this panel is kind of about one problem or one issue, privacy, where it really takes technologists. It takes lawyers, at least sometimes. It takes business people. It takes people who are really interacting with social science and the community and users so that they can understand what the issues are and so that all these different forces can work together to drive change. The second birthday is not quite so pleasant. So in about a month, October 25th, will be the 25th birthday of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act in the United States. Needless to say, when LACPA was written in 1986, the world was a little bit different. There was no webmail. There was email, but it was a client-server model. And so the current law on the books in the United States says if you have left mail on a server for more than 6 months, your privacy expectation has changed because you must have abandoned it. Because in 1986, that's how it worked. And the issue we have is that this law hasn't changed because it doesn't spontaneously change. And so my mission and my goal is to really find the ways to use working with companies. Microsoft is part of a coalition called Digital Due Process, as are we. Working with consumers to educate them about issues. Finding ways that technology can be used to make things more transparent so that there's all these tools that we can put together to really force change and see, craft an environment where privacy can be respected, where people can actually control their own personal information. And so we can really go forward in a way that we don't have to have only our choices are we live a totally transparent life, or we go off the grid and that just delays the inevitable finding. So that's really my big question is how do we do that? And it's still something we're working on, and I'm really excited to see all the people who are working on it here and elsewhere finding ways to really adapt different disciplines and different tools to make change.
So, Chris, you and I have both had the pleasure of working with our friends at the Berkman Center, Harvard Law School, 2 stops that way. One of the things that I think we've both gotten out of that experience is a sense that when it comes to technology, of the sort of 4 regulatory forces that you mentioned that Larry Lessig has documented, law is really, really slow. And also has the tendency to sort of hang around even when it isn't necessarily all that directly helpful, much as you're referencing with a 1986 law. Do you think, given the fact that there are market forces, technological forces, normative forces that all seem to be pointing towards more exposure of data, a really changing attitude of privacy, do you think we're heading for some sort of legal collision when sort of law catches up and tries to deal with this, or are you sort of hopeful that the sorts of initiatives that you're engaged in right now are going to find some way to sort of head this off at the pass before we hit a point of confrontation?
Well, I'm obligated to be hopeful that what I'm working on will be successful, clearly. But no, I think there is a challenge that, in many cases, laws have been written and they've really been based around understanding of technology as it was then. ECPA is a very good example, but they're legion. And of course, you have even more issues when you deal with international issues where different countries have different rules and, of course, different respect for those rules in terms of protecting information and privacy and things of that sort. I think one of the things that I do see and that I'm optimistic about is that law can be used to, not just as an independent club to force change or to regulate directly, but where law can increase transparency, it can promote dialogue. One of the issues we have constantly is issues of we are fairly confident that companies get lots and lots of requests for information about their users. But we don't know how many because there is no record of that that's required to be published. And it would be great if there were a law that simply said, the Department of Justice has to produce a wiretap report every year that says we have issued 2,000 wiretaps in 2010. And there's actually a section in that report for computer wiretaps. There were 7 in 2010. And the reason there were 7 is you don't need to tap a computer to intercept a live communication when you could just go to an endpoint and demand it without needing a search warrant, without needing a wiretap order. The more transparency we have, the more information there is to have a public dialogue about this, the more all these different pieces can really work together. And law is one way, and maybe in some cases a necessary way, to really enable a public dialogue about this, because the information may not come out because of market pressure. There may be, that may be just the nudge that is needed to really allow all these other pieces to work. But I think they have to be part of it. It can't be just the law dictates and everything runs happily ever after that. So I'm not that much of a lawyer.
So, Kate, you're a provocateur, as we just saw before, a writer, a musician. You're also a very talented researcher and ethnographer, and I know that you've been trying to figure out some questions of privacy from a very different perspective in Gujarat, yes? So I wanted to ask you, sort of based on that experience of talking about questions of privacy in a very different setting than the setting that I think most of us are used to thinking about. What were the biggest sort of surprises? What are the biggest messages we should take away from your experience there as we think through these questions of privacy?
Well, it's a big question. I think for me, the really killer question was thinking about how privacy is incredibly culturally sensitive. And it really depends on where you are in the world and who you are in terms of what you think privacy is and how it should be experienced. So I was have been doing a project for over 18 months now, which is based in Gujarat and specifically around villages which are around the Great Rann, which is a big desert between India and Pakistan. And we've been spending time in the villages there with 2 other anthropologists, Kathy Kittner, who's at Intel, and Joe Tackey, who's at RMIT in Melbourne. And we've basically been working with women who are living below the poverty line in effectively very poor villages to see how they're using mobile phones or cell phones. And I guess the first thing that was really interesting is that if you're living in a single room dwelling with 6 or 7 other people and there is no divided space, then your idea of privacy is very different, and your ability to have a private conversation is very seriously constrained. So I think about the Latin root of the term privacy, which comes from the idea of privatus, to separate, to keep things apart. You can't separate and keep things apart if you're living in a single room dwelling with 6 or 7 other people. But what was really interesting was to see how these women were using mobile phones, and these were always very basic, often first generation Nokia phones. And these are women who were not, in many cases, literate, but they'd used the phone in very basic ways, sometimes with their own systems of symbols to sort of hack how they were using the phones. They would come up with agreed messages that, #* will mean this. But what was really remarkable were the stories they would tell me about just taking voice calls, which might seem like a fairly everyday thing to us. But for these women, they were saying that it was the first time that they could have a private conversation where at least half of the conversation wasn't being overheard, and maybe at least not everybody in the village knew who they were talking to. And this might sound like a trivial thing, but for some of these women, it was incredibly important. They could speak to their family of origin. Often, they'd be living with the family they'd married into, and they couldn't talk to their family about how they were feeling, or if things were going on that they were worried about, if they were afraid of things. They had no way to make those sorts of contacts. So to have privacy for them was extraordinary. They told me stories about the mobile phone being like food because it was so important to their sense of sustenance. I mean, these were really, really moving stories. So in some ways, I think it's really changed some of the dynamics around gender and privacy in these kinds of villages. The other thing that's interesting too is to think about the politics of mobility. It's not just about sort of mobile phones, it's also about where you can move in space. So in many of these villages, women can't really leave the home after dark. So if it's nighttime, you have to be indoors. So the mobile phone allows you to continue social relationships and in some cases, to run your business after hours, which was incredibly empowering for some of these women. So in those ways, I think mobility has to be understood both in terms of a technology, but also in terms of how you deal with space. So I think in some ways these sort of nuanced understandings of what privacy means culturally often get overlooked, but it's often quite different when we move outside of a very sort of privileged Western context. But I don't want to sound like somebody who is just singing the praises of technology, because actually mobile phones are still operating within very traditional social hierarchies, right? So we might see in many cases that it's the male head of the household who still controls who gets to use the phone and for how long and how much will be spent on the phone. And in other cases, the most sort of, should we say, sort of focused upon population, the population of greatest concern is still young women. So if you're a young and unmarried woman, your use of the mobile phone was seen as being quite dangerous or quite disruptive. So young women were really being observed in these villages, and in many cases they just weren't allowed to use mobiles because who knows, they could be talking to people that mightn't be appropriate, or they might be forming relationships that weren't improved. So there are still some very traditional dynamics there that the technology is still working within. But I think over time we're going to see some really interesting dynamics emerge.
For people who end up doing ethnography of technology, there's sort of this narrative of, here's this technology, we thought it worked one way because we introduced it into the developed world. It may have taken on sort of 1 or 2 or 3 different uses, but then it moves into the developing world and it takes on just radically different use that we hadn't even thought about. At the same time, with some of the spaces that we're sort of thinking about and talking about here, social networking spaces, to a certain extent, it's all the same space. And so having a radically different behavior pattern with Gujarati women ends up literally in the same shared space with American teenagers. Do you see any sort of collisions starting to happen as we see things like social media platforms that are used both in India and the US and Australia, sort of bringing together people who probably don't think of themselves as using the same space?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I think in some ways it's too early to tell. So with the populations that we were working with, they don't have social media. They've never seen the internet. They have no sense of what that might be. So computers are really not part of village life. In some cases there might be a computer, but the mobile phone has radically overtaken the computer and the internet in these sorts of communities. So we're still waiting to see what will happen when we start to see the emergence of phones that give them access to the internet in the same way, because at the moment it's still very first gen. But working with populations in big cities in India, you see something very different, obviously. The big cities are very similar to Sydney or to Boston in terms of the way that young people are using social media. But there's always a twist. There's always a cultural twist. So one that I found fascinating was we were having a discussion with a young man who was talking about how he used Facebook. And like many young men, he uses Facebook for dating. It's like, let's see who the cute chicks are and what they might be up to. But in his case, he was always checking to see what caste women were. So caste was actually the first question around whether or not this woman might be somebody who would be suitable to go on dates with. So this is not something that we use as a setting necessarily in Facebook, but he was, and you can. So what's really interesting is going to see how companies are actually tweaking their interfaces to try and represent particular kinds of cultural sensitivities, but also to see how they're being tweaked back, how they're actually being changed. And this is what I think is really interesting about mobile technology. There's this great term called jugaad, which means making do. And it means that you open things up, you hack them, you change them, you make them work to suit the conditions. And that idea of that the uses for things are sometimes not what they were designed for, but the street will have its own uses, was so evident and so present in India. To see these kinds of new hacks and new ways of using technology was really inspiring.
Alessandro, I know that we're sort of preaching to the choir here, right? Because your work for many years at CMU and your work on privacy and behavioral economics, and these are all questions that I know that not only have you written and thought about, but you've also sort of carried out experiments about, and have really helped put some of the dismal into the dismal science of economics as we start finding out what people really do and really think about in the privacy space. Out of all that work, much of which has been extremely surprising, what are the big surprises that you feel that a group like this needs to be thinking about in the context of privacy?
One of the big topics, so big that I don't even feel yet comfortable working on, or at least publishing about, but because we are in a small group of friends and we are not being filmed at all, then I can talk about, is what are really the costs of privacy? How do we define them? Sometimes I wonder, the economics of privacy has been along for quite a while. The first writings in this area date back to the late 1970s, early 1980s. Chicago school scholar, pioneers like Posner and Stigler were already writing at the time. But over the years, this area has really exploded after more or less 2000. And sometimes I wonder, much of good has come out from this explosion in economics of privacy, but I wonder whether we have inadvertently created a frame of mind where if you cannot prove or show a quantifiable economic dollar damage, then there is no problem. There is no cost to privacy whatsoever. So the struggle I face within myself, where my economists at and then my behavior economists at, is I feel that the need for privacy is so universal, so widespread. And in a way, the beautiful study Kate was referring to also testify to that. In fact, it reminded me of a study by Murphy, an ethnographer, who also went to Java and Bali trying to see how people in Java and Bali back in the 1950s conceptualized and acted on privacy concerns, and found that the absence of architectural barriers between people created stiffer social etiquette. So the people were less likely to ask personal questions unless a very strong and long bond existed. So the point being, if privacy is so widespread, the need for privacy is so widespread, there must be some clear, obvious benefit. So can we, within the mainstream economic discourse, prove that there is this benefit and prove that there are costs when privacy is invaded, or do we need to resort to the concept of anonymity, of the psychological cost rather than the purely the economic cost? So this is one of the big questions that I don't feel comfortable yet studying, but I keep thinking about.
So let me push on that a little bit, right? Because the danger is that economics may not be the frame to think about this, that putting a price on the value of privacy is very, very difficult to think in the context of Gujarat, where clearly you have women's lives changed, where they get this sort of incremental increase in privacy. And I suspect we could go and do regression studies and try to figure out whether it's the phone that makes them more productive and the ability to communicate, or whether somewhere in there we can find a quality of life improvement that's sort of directly connected to privacy. But it does seem a little bit like, you know, trying to pin down Jell-O. What you care about this space, you think an enormous amount about it. When you think about privacy and the value of it, do you think of it in legal terms? Do you think of it in cultural terms? Do you think of it in personal terms? When you try to frame the importance of these questions for the people that you're working with, what is it that you, how is it that you frame that question?
I mainly, and this may be controversial, but I'm not trying intentionally to be, I mainly think about that in terms of control. And by control, I mean the following. There is in the literature, in the scholarly literature of privacy, there are pages and pages about privacy and control. But usually, the focus is control of a person's information as a means to achieve privacy. Okay? I find that in a normative sense, that makes sense. We want people to have control of their personal data. But that's a necessary, not sufficient condition for privacy. In fact, some of our own experiments show that if you go from a normative statement, how the world should be, to a positive statement, how the world really is, the more you make people feel in control of their data, the more risk they're going to take with their data. It's a phenomenon analogous to you ask people to wear a seatbelt and wear helmets, they start driving faster or riding faster. So we find that in positive terms rather than in normative terms, more control, paradoxically, can create less privacy. So the important issue here, to me, of control is inverting the question and thinking in terms of how knowing personal information about the person is a way to potentially control the person. So this is, to me, the angle which I'm not sure I can literally describe in economic terms without resorting to the usual example of price discrimination. If I know what your consumer type is, then I can charge you more or less and extract more surplus away from you. But there is more than that. More to that, sorry.
So we've got at least two solutions on the table here for sort of how we start thinking through privacy in sort of instrumental terms, as people who think about this as researchers or designers or so on and so forth. We have from Chris sort of a call for transparency here, and essentially using the law to make systems more transparent so we can have better discussions about this. From Alessandra, we have this really neat sort of inversion of the paradigm of control, and sort of saying the fact that we have control over our information isn't necessarily the right way to think about this, because we all know that more control may make us take more risk. It's really having the ability to control through someone else's information that is potentially where we want to take a risk on. So Kate, give us a solution here. Give us a tool for our toolbox as we start to think this through.
Well, it's interesting. Ethnographers don't like to think that they're in the business of giving solutions, but we love the idea of tools and toolboxes, so I can work with that. I think when we start conceptualizing the breadth of issues that might be covered in this term privacy, one of the things that I think is really interesting is not just thinking about cultures, but also thinking about time. So we haven't talked about the frame of long time around privacy, that it's not just now, it's not just a couple of years hence, but it's the longue durée in terms of what's going to happen to our information. And I think about that across cultures, that we're generating all of these traces, all of these paths, regardless of who we are and where we are, that are actually being collated and used in ways that none of us right now really know, and there is no one in this room who has a full sense of how their data is being used, let alone what might be happening to that data in future. So I think one of the things going forward that we need to think about in terms of solutions is addressing this issue of time and privacy. And that means from a systems level, allowing people to actually have very granular control about exactly what is getting used and by whom, but also thinking about for how long. So the idea of, the right for information to die, the right for things to disappear, is actually a significant discussion that's now happening in Europe. And I think it's one of the discussions that we could all benefit from participating in, to think about how do we think about the end of information? How do we think about protecting the life cycles of data? So that's something that I'd throw in, at least as a tool, if not a complete solution.
It's sort of information as a temporary tattoo rather than as one actually made out of ink. You know,
a henna tattoo.
You're sort of hoping that your Facebook status might, you know, gently fade in color, you know, over a course of a couple of days, rather than, you know, than remaining on your arm for years and years to come.
Or rather than being connected to my Spotify account, where everybody on Facebook will know every single album that I'm listening to for the next 20 years, which is a horrifying thought.
My just gentle pushback on that, I got sent a wonderful link today, which was that someone has scraped all of GeoCities before Yahoo shut it down, and created an 850 gigabyte torrent, and put it online. Has put together this wonderful sort of visualization of this, and as it happens, GeoCities was the main competitor to my company, Tripod, and trounced us. I mean, totally destroyed us. Though Tripod still remains and still has this sort of online presence, but they're both ghost towns, and they're both sort of missing in the Internet Archive. And I'm sort of wondering, you know, whether this fear that everything stays on record forever actually stands up to that long time test. There's actually, you know, really good evidence of sort of bit decay. It's actually very, very hard to find evidence of what we were doing online 10 years ago, 5 years ago.
If it's embarrassing and significant, it stays. Exactly.
I got to tell you, most of my designs from the late 1990s pretty embarrassing, but also pretty hard to find. Do you think that's true? Do you think that this sort of personal information somehow has a much longer lifespan than in some ways we've actually seen out of digital data in the past?
Yes, that's absolutely a fair point. In fact, there has been all this discussion how one of the longest, most durable tools for communication are books, and not floppy disk, right? However, for me, going back again to my background, for my angle as a behavior economist, the issue of time is so crucial because, and I've been discussing this over and over, but I still like the topic so much, the problem of immediate gratification, which is related to hyperbolic discounting, how human beings discount future events, future expected costs and benefits. It turns out that we human beings suffer from immediate gratification. We tend to gratify our immediate self, pushing the cost of our future self. By and large, this is true in many fields, including privacy. That means that even if we have a very significant danger in our future, we tend not to pay that much attention to that. That even happens when a danger is death. Studies by my colleague George Lowenstein at CMU show that there are certain medicines that patients need to take regularly. If they do not take them regularly, they become actually particularly dangerous, and they can increase your risk of death later on in the long run, not the next morning. And so what? Lotteries, where your regular taking of the pill is prized with money, are much more successful than the fear of death if you don't take the pill regularly. So people are more motivated by a little lottery of $2 than the risk of dying 10 years later. If that happens with serious, with the risk of death, how can we think about protecting our privacy 10 years from now?
So, I mean, Chris, that sounds like sort of an incredible challenge, right? I mean, because the work that you're doing is not just with the legal system and not just with corporations. It's really helping individuals sort of figure out how do they advocate for their own rights, how do they advocate for privacy within these systems that we're building. Alessandro seems to be making a pretty convincing case that people, for the most part, don't do this. How do we get sort of an end user into this discussion? How does ACLU think through questions like that?
I mean, much of it really is just, again, it's the educating a user about technology requires technology. It's a starting point. If you can use a tool to give someone visualizations, there have been wonderful visualizations about the evolution of Facebook privacy, or graphic stories of Project Gaydar from MIT, where you can take social networking connections and determine people's sexual orientation, resonate with people. But how do you? They accomplish some of the, I have an immediate threat and I will respond to it. Dealing with the long-term, time discount is, I don't know. I don't have a solution to that yet. I do think that one of the things that we are seeing is that we have these different, there are lots of different ways of conceptualizing privacy and harms and such, but one of the things we think about is you have kind of 4 different points where privacy can be implicated. And there's collection of information, retention of information, use of information, and disclosure of information. And these all have different aspects. And one of the ones that I'm most curious to see play out, although I don't know how it's going to work, is the collection side. Because we're reaching a point where the public is aware that information is being collected. And I'll be fascinated to see if people's behavior really starts to change when they see more stories, when they see more, maybe, again, it may not be the long term because they don't have the perception of that. You have mom and dad saying to the teenagers, don't post that bad picture. And of course, the teenager goes and says, okay, I can set my privacy control so you can't see it. All set. But I think really we're going to see where these different pieces, but retention and collection really are going to be important here because it's not just how the information can be used and be harmful in the future. It's about how does the perception of it being collected actually change behavior, and how can we help people understand, and not in a way that means get scared off, but hopefully it's a way that you understand the trade-off and you say, okay, I want to know that my information will be protected if I'm going to even share in the first place. I'm going to adjust my Facebook use if you're going to change your policies. Different ways where we can really use different people's perceptions. But it's not, the time delay is probably the hardest question you could have asked me because that's something that is a really tough thing for any user, anyone even in this room to understand what's going to happen in 10 years where smart grids and GPS and this aggregate disparate information that all seems fairly innocuous in and of itself, but you put it together and the consequences are beyond what people can understand. How do you have going back to someone else's, do you have a retroactive solution for the data that you didn't even know was being collected 5 years ago by a third party who you don't even know, they've been bought out by 3 other companies since then? I don't know.
And it sounds like before any of us actually know this, we may need sort of the global experience of being caught on Facebook drinking an underage beer. It may be this sort of, highly personalized wake-up about the power of this that sort of takes privacy out of a purely theoretical into a practical realm for a lot of folks.
And then I'll say one of the efforts we're making right now is to drive the point that ECPA will be 25. We're actually trying to specifically reach out to people who are under the age of 25. Sure we have some in this room? Anyone under 25 here? A handful. So we have people who were born after our electronic communication privacy law, and the more we can resonate with the fact that your world has changed, and you know what's going on to some extent, and these other protections aren't, it's really a way to build up, because we're not going to have pictures on Facebook of our teenage drinking years. They may exist in hard copy somewhere.
But we've got yours, and they're archived, and we're actually publishing research on them in the very near future. So just wanted to be clear on all of that. If we just get a round of applause for our great panelists here. Thank you very much.
Okay, and thank you very much for leading this wonderful discussion. And let's thank both him and the speakers of the whole day for what we heard. Okay, and I will